connected from your room, please mute it. That will be the main reason. Aha. You got it? Mute yours. There's another computer. Oh, because my name is
Chika,
Hi, you are there. Welcome, bro.
how are you?
I'm fine.
Welcome, brother.
Longest time.
How are you doing?
We are surviving the COVID.
Sorry? Sarsh?
Hi, Suri. Janan?
Amrash Damkasha.
Bazli abang masih jadi medamu. Antara.
Imagine. Suri Danano?
Hah? Semua joiner.
I Arab. Menurut
Nyana lagi surapat tu.
እሺ አረኩሽ
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
It's Ali. I'm helping with the webinar. Elizabeth, at the bottom of the screen, when it's in question and answer time, they'll post their questions in the chat, or on the tiles on the screen, there'll be a little hand that will appear when people want to ask a question. Which I think it's in the top left-hand corner. As today's.
I have a chat. I see the chat.
Okay. Yes. So during Q&A, they can either post their questions in the chat, and if you could please read that out for us, or in the top left-hand corner of the tiles with everyone's faces. There will be a hand that will appear when someone wants to raise their hand to ask a question. So that it can be done either way.
The hand will be where? Where is the hand?
I'm going to see if the host screen can raise. Sepida, can you raise your hand?
Where?
Go to
I don't hear a hand section. Where is the?
I'm just trying to find mine.
We're just trying to find it on Sepida's.
Okay.
Either do.
Yeah, Elsie, you can see it on mine. I just did.
Oh yeah, Victoria.
I don't see it. Okay.
On Victoria.
Can you see the hand now, Elsie?
On.
Okay, right there. Okay, I got it. But it's on your screen, not on mine.
It should be, but just look at the reaction, Milo.
Huh?
Reaction.
There's a recording and there's a enhanced encryption and meeting information. I don't hear a hand. Anyway,
I think we're gonna have to go with then checking the chat box, because there's so many participants that it's moving around all the time. So we can see it on two different screens here.
And I can collate the questions for her.
So Sepida is gonna.
Okay,
cool. Yeah, you can.
I'll put the questions together for you and email them to you.
That's great.
Okay,
cool.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me know when we are ready so I can
I think we're ready to start. It's 15:02. Let's start.
We should start. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon from this side of the world, and good morning for you guys on the north. Welcome to our meeting of Other Universals. Just to say a bit about Other Universals, thinking about politics and aesthetics from the post-colonial locations. It's a supranational project supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, coordinated by Professor Suren Pillay and the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. The project creates a consortium of scholars across a number of universities in South Africa, UWC, UCT, and WITS, in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa University, in the Middle East, American University of Beirut, and in the Caribbean, the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, and in West Africa, the University of Ghana, Legon. So this is a brief synopsis of Other Universal, the project of Other Universal. Today's speaker is Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Just to give you a little bio about him, he received his academic training in France, an alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He took his PhD, Doctorat d'État, in philosophy at the Sorbonne in 1988, where he also took his BA in 1977. His field of research includes Boolean algebra of logic, history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy, and literature. He's the author of numerous books, including Islam and the Open Society, Fidelity and Movement in the Philosophy of Mohammed Iqbal, that was published at Codesria in Dakar in 2011, African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the Idea of Negritude, that was published in 2011 at Seagull Books, and the link of the scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, published again in Codesria at Dakar in 2016. Open to Reason, Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with Western Tradition at Columbia University Press in 2018 in New York, among many of his work. So Professor Diagne's current teaching interests include history of early modern philosophy, philosophy and Sufism in the Islamic world, African philosophy and literature, and 20th century French philosophy. So I invite Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne to speak. He'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have two discussants that will come along later. So Professor Diagne, I invite you to come to the podium of Zoom.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this webinar, as it is called now. And I would like to thank the consortium. I didn't know very much about the consortium itself. I knew about my friend Suren Pillay, who asked me to make a presentation of my book in search of my book that I co-authored with Jean-Loup Amselle, In Search of Africas. But I'm happy to discover the whole project and everybody who's participating in the seminar. So thank you for being here. I understand that some of you may have read the whole book, and Suren has circulated an introduction, the introduction of the book, and the first two chapters, I believe. That's if I understand correctly. So the best way for me to just give an introduction to the conversation, and I'm really very much looking forward to hearing the two discussants of the book. So the best way would be to tell you first about the history of the book. How did we come to co-author, French anthropologist Jean-Loup Amselle and myself, this book? Let me say quickly that in 2008, Jean-Loup Amselle had published a book in French, titled in French, L'Occident décroché, enquête sur les postcolonialisme. The West delinked, that would be a literal translation, an inquiry on postcolonialism. And he basically, his argument was to say that somehow the West as a location of universality, of universalism, was under attack, an attack coming from what he called the tricontinental post-colonial academics. Tricontinental because those academics would come from East Asia, India mainly, also South America, all the people working in so-called decolonial studies, and from Africa as well. And the people coming from Africa would be mainly to be found in CODESIA. CODESIA, the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, as you all know it, is this Pan-African organization where you have, which is home, so an open home to all African academics in the field of social sciences and humanities, and even aspects of the exact sciences. So what Jean-Loup Amselle did in that book was, as I said, denounce these tricontinental post-colonial academics, and he devoted, basically his approach was to devote a few pages or a few paragraphs to all different intellectuals that he considered to be those post-colonial authors and academics. And he would also make sure that at the end of every single chapter or paragraphs devoted to one of them, he would end with a sentence, which is supposed to be encapsulating in a very witty way what that author or that academic is all about. This is how I found myself summarized and encapsulated in one formula used by Jean-Loup Amselle, calling me an orientalized Afrocentrist, which is totally meaningless, actually. The only reason why he called me an orientalized Afrocentrist, so Afrocentrist would, I suppose, come from the fact that I devoted aspects of my work to African philosophy and to Senghor in Senghor's philosophy in particular, and orientalized because, as you mentioned in your introduction, and I thank you for that introduction, I did also work on Islamic philosophy and Muhammad Iqbal in particular. So the reason why this formula was just empty, he could have added, I don't know, if I was orientalized, algebraized Afrocentrist, because I also worked on the algebra of logic. That is the kind of approach he had in that book about the way in which self-defined, someone, a French intellectual and academic defining himself as speaking on behalf of the universal would characterize intellectuals and authors and academics from the global South working in the field of what is called postcolonial studies. So the book then, when it was published in 2008, basically received a shrug. I mean, nobody bothered answering or responding to it in any way. So I remember though, when it was just first published, someone sending me an email about it and saying, oh, there is this attack from this French intellectual, he's attacking everybody from CODESIA, we should respond. And when I discovered what the book was, I thought there was no need to respond. And this is also the position adopted by almost all my friends as well. Now, fast forward. 6 years later, I was invited in France, in the city of Lille, in the northern part of France, to give a keynote address at a philosophy festival. It's called the Cinephilo, and at that time it was organized every year by the city of Lille. I don't know if they still have it, but that time in November 2014, Africa was the guest of honor, Africa at the continent, and they wanted to present African philosophers and African philosophy. And I was invited to give a keynote address, and which I did. And Jean-Loup Amselle was there as well. And we were both invited by a radio, a very famous French radio, France Culture, to discuss with a moderator, the excellent journalist who's a good philosopher as well. Adèle Van Ret is her name. And this was the very first time I met actually Jean-Loup Amselle in person. And we had that discussion about universalism and his take on postcolonial studies. Then we traveled together on the train going back to Paris, and we had a very jovial, friendly discussion. And he mentioned at one point that this was a very interesting discussion to have, because the crucial topic of our times was, he thought, and I agree, the question of the universal. What happens to the universal in this post-colonial moment, as I would call it, philosophical moment of the post-colonial? And we said yes, but there was nothing precise and no follow-up at all, but this was in 2014. 3 years later, 2017, this time I was invited by the French book fair, the Salon du Livre de Paris, which is always organized in March of every year. And I was invited to give, again, a keynote address during that book fair. And at the end of my talk, here is Jean-Loup Amselle, and this time he came with a wonderful, great lady, director of the literary section of Albin Michel, the publisher in France, Hélène Monsacré. And so the project that we discussed had become now concrete. And Hélène Monsacré just invited us to meet in her office and discuss in a very concrete way, ways in which we could have that discussion turned into a book. This is how this book came to exist. And the way we did it, we had a first meeting in Hélène's office, as I said. Then we agreed on a certain number of topics. Mainly the overarching topic was universal, the question of the universal. And after that, we agreed to exchange emails on those topics. And this is how basically we wrote this book together. We had another meeting, just one meeting via Skype, and another meeting in person when I was visiting Paris toward the end. And this is how the book came to exist. So as I said, at the center, at the core of the book was this question raised first in Amselle's book, L'Occident décroché, then in our meeting in France Culture in Lille in 2014, and that is the question of the universal. So if you allow me to just read it in the introduction that you had, that Søren circulated, let me read. This is at the bottom of page 4 and the beginning of page 5. I say the question of the universal that can be formulated in these terms: is the post-colonial the first phase of a new universal, one which would be truly universal, as it would be inclusive, or is it, on the contrary, the denial of all universalism, the triumph of the particular, and of fragmentation? Basically, in this sentence that I just read, you have the whole problematics of the book. And you have summarized here the positions from which each of us was coming. When we talk about here the phrase, a new universal that would be truly universal. Truly universal is, this is something I wrote, and truly universal is an allusion to the book by Immanuel Wallerstein, who left us recently, as you all know. His book on European universalism, when he said that after European universalism has come to an end in a way, it is time to look for a truly universal, a universal that would truly be a universal, because that universal would be inclusive. And the last part of the sentence I just read is, on the contrary, our period, the denial of all universalism, the triumph of the particular of fragmentation. This was the position of Jean-Loup Amselle. Now, I would like to say that this is not new, obviously. And what do we mean by the fact that this is a time of a new universal? In other words, what is the old universal? What was the universal? And I look at that from the standpoint of my own discipline, which is philosophy. At one point in the history of the West, philosophy was constructed as the unique telos, the unique destination, so to say, the unique destiny of the West. It has not been like that before. It was truly an invention of 19th century mainly, and the main figure who invented that notion of the West being the incarnation of the philosophical spirit was Hegel. And it is interesting to see that Hegel did that, made that construction at a time when colonialism, or the new phase of colonialism after the colonization of the Americas in the 15th century, and of the 15th century, 16th century, the new phase of colonialism was going to start. When I say that this is a very recent construction, I mean that if you look at philosophers such as Descartes or Leibniz, or even the medieval, they never thought that philosophy was something that they owned. Even Descartes, who is a philosopher of radical beginning, thought that the very matrix of his thinking came from the discipline of algebra. And he said, well, this matrix of my thinking, which is algebra, as its name indicates, has a foreign origin. The very word algebra, as you know, is Arabic. Leibniz, a philosopher like Leibniz, was interested in Chinese thought and Chinese writing, ideograms, etc., etc. So the openness to other part of the world as lands of philosophy was something natural until the time when philosophy was reconstructed, established as belonging in a unique and exclusive way to Europe and defining European universalism. And this is what Hegel did during his lectures on the history of philosophy that he gave in Berlin in the early decades of the 19th century. And at the time when he was doing that, when he was showing that the spirit with capital S, or philosophy with capital P, was uniquely European, he was looking at the history of the spirit. And as you know, those pages from Hegel are very famous. He just considered that Africa in particular was totally outside of the realm of the spirit, forever wrapped in the dark mantle of the night, to use his very poetic expression. And the most important aspect is he saluted, because he was giving these lectures in Berlin at that time, he saluted in 1830 the conquest of the city of Algiers by France, because he considered that this was the new adventure of the spirit, and that the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea, which is Northern Africa, had its vocation was to prolong Europe, but to prolong it as a colony. So this is the one general way of characterizing very quickly that old universal, as I have called it. Now, in modern time, when we don't look at Hegel anymore, but we look at contemporary Western philosophy, how it was dealing with colonialism directly. So Hegel saluted the conquest of Algiers. This was the beginning of this new phase of colonialism. Now, in 1933, Edmund Husserl, German philosopher again, very important for modern philosophy and contemporary philosophy, gave a conference in Vienna at a time when he thought that Europe was in danger. Obviously, 1933, just a couple of decades earlier, the First World War has started, which was a kind of European suicide. And it was also, when he gave that conference, Hitler has just been elected in Germany. He has seen the Nazi party come to power in Germany. So he was aware of the crisis that Europe was witnessing again. And he gave that conference in Vienna as a kind of warning to Europe to not self-destruct. And he saluted the universalism of Europe, saying, basically telling Europe, you should remember that you are the land of universalism. And I'm in particular interested in one aspect of the way in which he defined that European universalism. He said, if India understands fully her own interest, I'm paraphrasing, India would try to Europeanize, to become European as much as it can. But a Europe which is fully aware of what it is would in no case try to Indianize. And I think that in that particular sentence is summarized this idea that the West is the unique incarnation of a universal, and that this universal has to give orientation to the rest of us, to the rest of the world. This was interesting because it addressed very directly the relationship that Europe has with other regions of the world. What does it mean for India to understand the telos of Europe as universal, and what should it mean for Europe to understand itself as the incarnation of the Logos and the universal? 1933, 1955, something very important happened. 1955, I consider always to be the time of the postcolonial and decolonization because of the Bandung conference. And by the way, I think that we should be celebrating much more every single anniversary of the Bandung conference. We have somehow let that conference slip out of our minds, and we do not attach enough importance to what happened during that conference, because we think basically, yeah, okay, it was a conference announcing decolonization, and the decolonization is going to take place, etc. Symbolically and philosophically, it is important to think that this was the very first time the global South was having a conference, a meeting, not organized by Europe. Usually Europe was the center organizing every single conference. Everybody would be invited by Europe to conferences. And this was the time when the global South met without the presence of Europe, and Europe was not the subject, it was the object of the conference at that time. Just that was a very important historical event and philosophical event, as it was an answer to that universalism, as I have said. Why? What does it mean? Basically, that this was a kind of insurrection of the plural against this idea that everything, every kind of multiplicity has to come under some form of unity with the guidance of European universalism. The idea of Europe being the center and everything else being at its periphery was just destroyed by the very setting of the conference of Bandung. And what it meant also was that now you have to take into account the multiple and the plural as such. In philosophy, usually when you talk about the multiple, you are always looking at the way of reducing this multiple to the one and the many, nature and culture. These are the big binaries upon which philosophy is constructed. So multiplicity has always been considered as a bad thing. If you are in front of the multiple, you have to look at a way of reducing them to the one. That is the fundamental philosophical idea behind the notion of universalism. Now, what we were invited to do after 1955, taken symbolically as what I have called this insurrection of the multiple as such, the insurrection of the plural, was to think of a universal that would not be a reduction of the plural or the multiple to the one, but the full acknowledgement of the plural. That is the challenge in which we are right now. How do we still have a horizon of universality that would not be a reduction of the plural? The philosopher, because we are in the French, I move now into the French academia, because this discussion about the universal has something very, very French, actually. It is a very French topic. The French philosopher Merleau-Ponty. French philosopher Merleau-Ponty wrote a text that I quote at length in this book. I don't know if it was in the first chapters, so you may have read it, or is it now inside the book, but in which he says, and this was a way for philosophy of taking into account what happened in Bandung. He said that this is not anymore the time of what he called the overarching universal, the universal coming from above. He said that universal is dead. Its time is now past. You cannot have anymore that overarching universal. The only form of universality, he said, the only universal you can look for is what he called a horizontal universal. What does a horizontal universal mean, or a lateral universal? A universal that would be the effect, the product, the outcome of negotiation between languages, cultures that are not only multiple, but also equivalent. In other words, they are all on the same plane of immanence. You do not have a culture that would be dictating what universalism is from above. If there is anything universal, it would be a universal of negotiation. And the model for that, as I have presented it in our discussion, in my discussion with Jean-Loup Amselle, is the model of translation. If you have equivalent languages, the only way you could have a language of all languages is not to decide that there is one imperial language which is the quintessence of what a human language should be. It is through translation. And this is something that Ngugi wa Thiong'o eloquently said in a very short sentence when he said that the language of all languages is translation. Because translation happens, or should happen. We know that this might be a naive picture because you have also domination between languages and so on and so forth. But if you look not at the sociology or the politics of translation, but now at the ethics of translation, what it means is that you make the effort of having languages come together and exchange and negotiate their own encounter in a way that cannot reduce totally the untranslatable. You will never reach this kind of transparency, universal transparency, when everybody will be singing together the kumbaya of universality and universal understanding. And untranslatability is part of the very process of translation, but that is what a model for this lateral universal, horizontal universal, a universal of negotiation, a universal of encounter might be. Now let me go towards a conclusion by saying that actually this kind of discussion and what I just presented is not new. If we remember, and this is something that we mentioned in the introduction that you have read, this takes us back to the late 1950s, when the authors of the movement of negritude were themselves thinking about what the relationship, what the dialectics between the particular and the universal is. And this is something you find in particular in Aimé Césaire and his famous 1956 text, which was his letter of resignation from the Communist Party. What did Césaire say in that letter of resignation, and why did he resign from the Communist Party? He was saying, well, we are fighting this Western European paternalism, which is believing that the West is naturally the stage for the universal, the location of the universal, and it is bringing everybody else, the rest of the world, to its own, into its own universality. And he said, but communist fraternalism is not much better than that colonial paternalism, because it is another version, he thought, of universalism and European universalism, which was in a way ignoring who he, that is his people, Black people, were, by saying, well, there is one universal class, which is the proletariat, and the proletariat, my friends, is here in Europe. Just wait for the proletariat to, as it is the universal class, to produce the universal revolution, and ipso facto, everybody would have emancipation. In other words, you Black people would be part of the train led by the universal class, which is the proletariat, and emancipation would come. And Césaire was saying, well, I still do not find myself in that form of universalism. And this was one of the reasons he gave, the main reason, the philosophical reason. He had political reason because of the actions of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, etc., that he mentioned quickly. But the fundamental point he made was to say, I do not want to suffer from an idea of universalism which is ignoring me and oppressing me, whether it comes from colonialism or whether it comes from your apparent generosity, you, my communist friends. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that, again, this is the discussion, somehow the background of the discussion I had with Amselle in this book. Because one has to understand where Amselle comes from. Amselle is a communist, and he believes in the universality of the notion of class. So he believes that everything having to do with identity, cultural identity, or the plurality, precisely the multiple, would be a distraction from the universal struggle, which is a class struggle. And I believe, and this would be my last word of conclusion, I believe that somehow the times that we are living in is somehow a vindication or an illustration of what Césaire was trying to say. When he and his friend Senghor were saying philosophically that there is not such a thing as a kind of ideal universalism up there, that the universal is always specifically incarnated in one particular instance. And that if you consider the particular to be an instance of the universal and not a fragmentation of the universal or negation of the universal, then the way towards the universal is through the particular. The reason why I'm talking about the times you are living in is that here is a time when you see blonde, blue-eyed women carrying something that says Black Lives Matter. And I'm just exaggerating that kind of picture, making the protester here a blonde, blue-eyed to mark the contrast. What does it mean? That when you say Black Lives Matter, you are not having a kind of particularist claim, something that Aimé Césaire did not want. Aimé Césaire said in that letter, I don't want to have a carceral conception of identity. I am not self-enclosing myself in some kind of identity and having only as my demand, a demand related to my identity. Otherwise, you would not have a public square anymore. You would have just a juxtaposition of identities. Everybody would be not arguing or having an argumentation or having an exchange or having translation, as I said, or negotiation toward the universal. Everybody would be just basically performing their own identity. What I'm saying here in the public square is that I'm performing my identity as a Black man. And if you are not a Black man, you cannot share my experience. So don't talk about it, etc. So you would have a juxtaposition of fragmented discourses instead of any kind of exchange. And what we are seeing, what we are witnessing with this universality of the slogan Black Lives Matter, when Black Lives Matter has come to mean human life in general and universally is priceless. I think this is the way in which we should be thinking about the relationship between the particular and the universal. And I would like to end on that point and note. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm really technologically challenged with this coronavirus technology, like Zoom and everything. So I didn't even introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Elizabeth Walde-Georgis. I am from Addis Ababa University. I'm from Ethiopia. So I read with interest what Professor Shurain has sent to us on the notions of the universal and universalism. And for those of us, I think you came up. I mean, before I allow the discussions to come in, I just want to have I just want to inject certain points. For those of us who are trying to inject class and class consciousness for all social movements, and from a country where I come from, where ethnic identity is really, really a form of struggle for the last 3 years, or even more than that. So you've made us think about the concept of the universal, the plurality of the universal and universalism. So I just wanted to say that before I introduce the two discussants will be Emma Dates. She's a doctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town and holds a fellowship in the Other Universals Consortium. She's working on political biography and friendship through the writings of the late leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress, Robert Sobukwe. And Dr. Chika Imba is a research fellow in the Religions and Philosophy section of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. He's working on a manuscript on the theme, Frantz Fanon's Cultural Humanism and the Challenge of Global Justice. Chika coordinates the Other Universals Hub at the University of Ghana, Legon. So Chika and Emma, I'm going to give you 10 minutes each to reflect on Professor Souleimane's talk. So should we start with Emma? Emma, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me, Elizabeth?
Okay, let's start with you.
Okay.
Huh?
1 moment. Sorry, I'm just quickly trying to find my notes. Okay, got it. So firstly, I want to say what an honor it is to be a discussant for Professor. So thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak to his work. Before I comment on the professor's remarks today, I want to say something briefly about how I came to his work and what it's meant to me since, situated as I am at this most southern tip of the continent. So a few years ago, I stood in for a colleague in our department's second year social theory course, and the introductory chapter from the Ink of the Scholars was on the syllabus. And I think the purpose of that chapter, and indeed of the course as a whole, was to encourage students to think more carefully about exactly what they were referring to when they referred to Africa, or as in the case of the book we're discussing today, perhaps Africa's. And to reject the cleavage of the African continent into two distinct realms, North and South, and to think, therefore, more critically about the idea, which is, as we know, propped up by so much colonial thinking and pedagogy, that real Africa is a place of intellectual and cultural darkness found south of the Sahara. And what I found really interesting when I was teaching this material is that although many of my students had little trouble identifying what was wrong with the, in inverted commas, heart of darkness view of the continent, they nevertheless clung to the idea that Southern Africa was authentic Africa and that the North was somehow not part of the continent. And they really struggled with the idea that Arabic was a language in which one could be African. And when I referred to the ancient Egyptians as Africans, somewhat anachronistically, I confess, but in service of what I took to be a political point worth making, some of my students challenged me by asking if Egyptians weren't really Arabs, and therefore not really African. So this strong idea of the south of Africa, south of the Sahara, as being authentic Africa, which comes to us through Hegel and other European intellectuals, is still very strongly there, I think, for many of us. The selected text from the Ink of the Scholars was also meant to challenge other kinds of ideas which are unfortunately still widely held. The idea, for instance, that Africa was not a place of writing until Europeans arrived, or the idea that what some folk now call Western civilization is actually just from the West and not by way of a multitude of other places that might include Cairo, Baghdad, Timbuktu, and Greece before Greece was considered European. So the introductory chapter of the Ink of the Scholars then led me to the rest of the book, and from there to other contributions Professor Diagne had made, particularly on the debate about Africanity, including in the volume Identity and Beyond, Rethinking Africanity, and then of course most recently in his contributions to In Search of Africas. I also think it's important to say that I came to Professor Diagne's work in the midst of an important but also very difficult moment in what I would call nominally post-apartheid South African history. And this was a moment in which younger generations of South Africans rose up on campuses across the country to challenge the Eurocentric nature of the academic project, or as Jan might put it, to challenge the right of their teachers to assert Europe's particularities as vertical universals. It had a very similar energy, I think, in many ways, to the energy that we've witnessed over the last few weeks as Black Lives Matter protests have moved through North America and Europe. But as hopeful as that moment was, and it was a very hopeful moment for many of us, it was also a moment in which some of the identities and divisions and kind of stories about what is civilization and who is the author of it and so on, bequeathed to us in the late 19th century, were sometimes reinscribed in the very moment that they were ostensibly being challenged. In the very moment that people were trying to challenge them, they were often also reinscribed. So, for example, many ideas about what was and was not Eurocentric were themselves a product of the kind of Eurocentric ideology and pedagogy in South African schools and universities. For instance, to take just one example, some students have been taught a kind of version of history in which science and scientific thinking was the kind of cultural and intellectual genius of the so-called West. Even though, like philosophy, scientific activity actually spans Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and many other parts of the globe. So it was almost as though in the moment of trying to challenge what was deeply Eurocentric about some of our curricula and modes of being and so on, there was also a kind of an acceptance of a very particular story that I think is cooked up in the 19th century. So for me, Diagne's texts and his contributions to this volume particularly remind us in a very unlabored and sensible way that while philosophies may be particular, the act of thinking or making sense of the world as philosophical thinking does, isn't. So philosophies may be particular, but philosophical thinking through our circumstances and trying to apprehend them, is an activity that everyone has been involved in and everyone can be involved in. It's kind of universal. And even philosophy may not be as particular, philosophies may not be as particular as they seem, because as Jan also reminds us, many, perhaps all of the great cultural and intellectual achievements were the product of encounters. So in the example from his book, The Ink of the Scholars, the Greeks, in what I think is now perhaps the most well-known example, learned from the Egyptians, among others, and significantly, as Jan points out, they had very little trouble acknowledging this. So it's only later that this becomes a problem for the story. And it's really only, I think, in the 19th century that the story begins to be dramatically rewritten and that the Greeks become not only European, but also...
2 minutes.
I'm running out of time, okay. But also white, both of which, of course, are absurd since neither identity nor position of power associated with those identities existed for Africans. But so what I've taken out of Diagne's work, apart from the incredible openness of his writing, the sense of openness to the world, and a sense that, as they say, nothing human is alien to him, is also this idea of encounters as the kind of base of knowledge, production, and cultural achievement. That at the base of all of those stories, if you return the historicity to those stories, you find sets of encounters and actually a very connected world rather than a very fragmented world. The question that I want to ask him though today, let me just see my notes quickly, sorry. So I want to ask Professor Diagne today, could we think about the universal as cultivating a kind of openness to the world that allows us to take up practices like translation? That's one way one question I would like to ask him. But I'd also like to ask him how one keeps, if you think about the universal as a kind of horizon or a workspace, which is the way that he describes it in this book, how do you keep that workspace open, that horizon open? How do you keep it from not becoming just another kind of particular regulatory ideal? And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Chika, can you come on? Chika, are you there? Chika. I don't know where Chika is. Chika, can you hear me?
I've just succeeded in unmuting myself.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you, Professor Diagne, for your presentation, which is actually a gift of a presentation, or the presentation of a gift, I should say. The pun is unintended. It is not often that we encounter, as Emma already pointed out, a paper, a book, or presentation that manages to be simultaneously profound. In this case, actually philosophically charged, and still manages to be legible, easy to follow, even perhaps for the uninitiated. I believe it's a remarkable achievement, especially in the rarefied context of postcolonial thought. On a personal level, I thank you, Bachir, for your paper, because I now feel more able to understand why I have not been able to finish my paper on decolonizing human dignity and global justice for quite some time now. The missing link became apparent even as I read the introduction that Suren had shared. That said, the rest of my comments will be presented as key moments for me. I mean, key moments that happened for me while I read or listened to your talk. I will pass a few comments and we will see if some might require you to unpack a few concepts or put ideas, certain ideas in a different context or perspective for better understanding or a better understanding. But the first key moment, I titled it The Important Distinction You Made Between the Universal and Universalism. I could immediately relate with this for reasons to do with my present research areas. For you, the universal is associated with the plurality of human languages. And if taken as such, for you, will bring about what Simon Niemeyer and John Drizek would call a world of meta-consensus and intersubjective rationality, a world of agreed procedures for human reasoning and charitable understanding of the character of human choices and reasons for decisions are consistently agreed upon. I mean, if we follow Niemeyer and Drizek in agreeing with you. Universalism for you to arrogant claims to proprietorship of the language of the Logos, or the elevation of one's particularity to the level of an uncontestable universal. For me, and as for my colleague, Richard Peters, and I think Bachir would encounter no difficulty agreeing to this, contestability is at the heart of this distinction. The universal is open and contestable, and for Bachir is not given. Whereas universalism, like all other philosophical isms, is a creed, an exclusivist ideology with insiders and outsiders. And at other times, universalism simply becomes vacuous, because it becomes everything and therefore nothing in order to hide its parochial nature. And this, of course, as always, in the interest of those who currently benefit from a false universal. The way out, for which I have no difficulty in accepting, is for you travel and learning the other's language. For travel and learning another's language is important for decentering oneself away from exceptionalism and leaving behind the universalism of the Logos in order to achieve a global meta-consensus. I'm returning back to Drizek. But I should ask Professor Jan, where should the likes of Donald Trump travel to? So I move over to the...
Could you say that again, please?
Yeah.
Just the last sentence, please.
I said, okay, the way out for you, Bachir, which I have no difficulty in accepting, is travel and learning the other's language. Because travel and learning another's language is important for decentering oneself. I'm paraphrasing you, away from exceptionalism and leaving behind the universalism of the Logos in order to achieve a global meta-consensus. But I asked that rhetorical question, where should the likes of Donald Trump travel? The second big moment for me, I titled The Coloniality of Universalism. The point you make here is that it will seem that the chasm between claimants to the ownership of the universal language among Europeans is just that, so that the French and the German can argue about which of their languages is truly faithful to the language of Logos. Though with, of course, you noted wide-ranging socio-political consequences. But then in the context of colonialism in Africa in particular, and in the precarious lives of African Americans, the problem assumes a very different, should I say, ontological dimension. The problem ramifies from language questions to something that's the likes of Sylvia Winter, Steve Biko, and Frantz Fanon actively recognized, some of them firsthand. The black person's questioned humanity on the basis of which in the what used to be the Belgian Congo, the Congo DRC, middle-class natives like Patrice Lumumba merely became evolved, aspiring human beings whose aspirations for Eurocentric, in the rendition of Eurocentric supremacists like Hegel and Lévi-Strauss, were ab initio ill-fated, unrealistic, in fact, unrealizable. The outcome, and I will quote Bachir verbatim for the first time, is that in the colonial world, the imperial language imposes itself as the incarnation of reason, and native languages, which cannot really have the status of languages, are defined in a negative way by their supposed shortcomings. So these languages will be described as lacking writing, as lacking abstract concepts, as lacking a future tense, as lacking the verb to be, and I should add, as lacking the quintessential attributes of human language. Then my third and final key moment, which I've entitled Countering the Communality of Human Rights in Africa and Parting Ways with Jean-Loup Amselle. I think I understand, Bachir, why you would agree with Kwesiwiredu and Amselle, and where you part ways with the latter to follow Aimé Césaire. For all lives can only matter if every particular group of lives, including that of people of color, matter and matter equally. We need to specify the content of the lives that matter. That is the constituents of, in my reading of your paper, the constituents of the universal. Perhaps you might wish to clarify a little more of this because of what I then say next. Bachir, some of your critics, African philosophers who criticize their views about what an African conception of human rights should look like, which again you express in the current book, argue that your position is ahistorical and doesn't always reflect African reality. Here, let me bring on board the Cameroonian political and social philosopher, Ajime Wingo. He is at Colorado, and I'm bringing him in because he published in the subsequent edition of Transition in 2009, right after your piece on individuals, community, and human rights appeared in Transition 101. He cites you as saying that human rights, no matter where, are truly and naturally the rights of the individual. Wingo held that you were right that the Mandate Oath lends credence to this way of thinking of human rights in Africa. But then he argues, and allow me to quote him at some length. Where he, Bachir, is wrong is in what that individualistic document means more generally. Let's start with his bold claim that human rights are truly and naturally the rights of the individual. But where, when, and under what circumstances are human rights truly and naturally the rights of the individual? These questions are, to say the least, fundamental to any cross-cultural philosophical study of human rights. The only way to avoid them is to adopt, as Jan appears to do, the concept of an ahistorical person who stands over and above prejudices and the relics of habits and cultures. And it is this transcendent conception of a person that allows Jan to make sweeping claims about the universality of human rights. Now, let me place Wingo's concerns side by side the content of a video posted online by a returnee African American early this week in the wake of protests following the killing of George Floyd in the US. In that video, the returnee compares the attitude of African Americans to that of Jewish Americans. He noted that there, that is the Jewish dispersion from their ancestral homeland, started many centuries before a similar fate befell Black people. But while the Jews haven't forgotten their homeland, always working to develop the state of Israel, while helping to support one another in America and elsewhere, Black people seem to have forgotten that America is not home and that they can never breathe in America. They will always have someone kneading on Black people's necks unless the home front is put in order. He praises Akon, I mean the Senegalese American singer, for being exemplary in this regard, for remembering the homeland. But then he names and bashes a number of prominent African American athletes and public personalities, which I'm refraining to mention here, for not doing anything to support fellow Black people. Rather, these wealthy Blacks in America engage in what, in my reading of this, the returnees' assessment of these wealthy Black Americans, that they engage in hallucinatory levels of conspicuous consumption in a vain effort to be respected by white people. I'm almost done now. Okay. What is of interest here is where the returnee plays the blame, Bachir. He blames the erosion of communal life among African Americans because they want to become like white people, to wear white masks, as Fanon would say, by imitating the individualistic lifestyle and then failing to do so while also losing their heritage in a double tragedy. I will stop here and yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chika. So Professor Souleymane, do you want to give, before we go to answer questions and answers, if you can reflect on the two discussants point of view, that would be nice. Okay.
Yes, indeed. I would like first and foremost to thank both Chika and Emma for this reading of my work and this wonderful presentation and this wonderful discussion. So I go very quickly on. Let me start with Chika, and I go very quickly on the first 2 points because they are basically comments agreeing with me on the difference between universal and universalism. It is true that these are different concepts. Universalism, basically universalism consider that plurality or multiplicity is anecdotal and that we should go back to what really matters, which is the unity of the universalism and so on and so forth. While universal starts with the plural, what you are saying is plurality is a fact. The world is diverse. You have different cultures, different languages, all of them equivalent. There is no language that would be above others and dictating what universality is. How do we go from that plurality and aim at a horizon of universality? So that would be a difference. And learning another language is a good model for that because you decenter yourself. Something I love to quote is coming a citation from German philosopher and poet Goethe, who said, if you know only one language, you do not know it. Because if you have no way of stepping out of your own language, you cannot see the peculiarities of your language, and you can do that only when you compare it to another language. So learning another language, bilingualism or multilingualism is not just a linguistic fact, but philosophically, it is emblematic of what it means to be able to decenter oneself. And decentering is a very important aspect of aiming at a universality of negotiation and so on. And let me give an example for that, actually, of that, what it means, what it could mean. I gave the model of translation. Let me give even a more concrete model of that. All the different COP, that the United Nations are organizing around environment and climate. Every single country trying to come together for this universal goal of actually saving our planet. We are just destroying our planet because we have until now adopted that Cartesian philosophy according to which we are masters and possessors of nature. We have turned nature into natural resources, and we thought that we could exploit nature in that sense. And we are realizing that we have to come together, and in coming together, all countries in a way are totally equivalent. Countries, different countries are bringing in different epistemological views of what the relationship of the human being is to nature, different from this epistemology of modern science, individualistic for that matter, and I'll come back to individualism, where the human being is considered to be master and possessor of nature and so on. So we agree on that. And also, I thank you very much for insisting on this notion of coloniality as the imposition of an imperial language, the idea that you have a model of a language that would be the incarnation of the logos, and every other language would be lacking something. And this idea of African languages, for example, lacking this or that, has been the colonial narrative, and linguists have opposed that. Sapir and Worf, who are better known for what is called the linguistic relativism, demonstrated that it is just absurd to say that any language lacks of anything. Every single language is complete in itself. So that's it. But let me come to the point you made in the human rights and the response that Wingo gave to my article in Transitions, which, by the way, on that topic, I come back more at length in my book on philosophy, African philosophy, The Ink of the Scholars, which is actually, Wingo is responding to something that was not my point. Individualism, you do not consider it by itself. You do not say in abstracto, are human rights the rights of an individual? The question, the argument was, when you oppose in the adoption of human rights, when you oppose the group and the individual, what are you doing philosophically? In other words, I was even more historical than historicism, because what I was taking into account, the story I was telling, was the concrete story of the adoption of the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. In fact, I was giving an account of the debate that took place, and it started around my own country. Actually, the big conference about that led to this adoption happened in Dakar, and the confrontation was between those who said, well, we are Africans, so we should not be having the individualistic view of human rights that the Europeans have. For us, the group is the bearer of rights, and the individual has duties vis-a-vis the group. And others were saying, no, if human rights have to have a meaning, you have to give a room to the very possibility that the individual could go against the group. Otherwise, you are going to impose upon the individual the ahistorical, essentialist continuation of something that you would present as tradition. It is the tradition that we should be exercising genital mutilation, for example, and this is the right of the group. Who are you as an individual to go against it, on what basis, etc. So my discussion of individualism and collective view of rights was very historical and actually actual. I was taking into account a debate as it was on the ground and not looking at some sort of transcendent concept of the person. Now, if you want to talk about history on that particular issue, what I do in the book with Amselle is now also look at a very concrete way in which you do have in West Africa this oral tradition and text about rights being the rights of the individual. Because if the view is that Africans are collectivists, they think more of the group and the individual is just an atom inserting herself into the group, etc. Well, the oath of the hunters in West Africa starts with very precise articles about human life. A life is a life, it says in the first place. You do not have a right of birth of any right upon of any life above another life, and so on and so forth. In other words, what this oral text recited by hunters in West Africa was saying was the affirmation of the uniqueness of one single individual life and every right that is attached to that life. So if you want to have very general notions about Africans being collectivists, it suffices of one counterexample given by this to just destroy your universal claim about that. But again, the main point is that I was not considering the individual as such, separated from the very dialectics and the historical confrontation of should the bearer of rights be the group, or should the bearer of rights be the individual? And the charter as we have it now is a compromise between those two. Even in its title itself, the African Charter of Humans and People's Rights shows you that the activists and also lawyers, etc., who ended up sitting together to draft it were making a compromise between those who insisted on the group, the tradition, and so on, and those who say no. It is important, if you want to talk about human rights, to give the individual the possibility to go against the group. But so that is clarified. One aspect about, yes, Africans being in the United States and having to think about the homeland, I mentioned Codesria, and let me just say what is great about our organization, Codesria. Codesria is a network. So in the field, on the particular aspect, because you can't just look at what Africans are doing in general for the homeland. Akon is doing what he's doing. So what are, for example, if we give it a precise translation, what are African academics doing? Codesria, as a network of African researchers from Cape to Cairo, has never lost a brain, the famous brain drain, because Codesria is precisely a network. And it is able to keep everybody working together. And that togetherness is something which is very important when you try to go in the direction of what you indicated as Africans working for the homeland as well. And this would be a good model for that. Now let me come to Emma's, I like very much the points that you made, and in particular about parts of Africa not being really African. You know, I mentioned Hegel and the way in which his vision of the uniqueness of Europe was built at the same time as Europe was launching the second wave of colonialism. Another aspect of Hegel's thought was to proceed with what I would call a vivisection of Africa. He decided that ancient Egypt was such a brilliant civilization, it could not possibly belong to the African continent, so it has to be attached to Asia. I mentioned very quickly in passing that for him, Northern Africa, what we call the Maghreb, could not either belong to the African continent, because since it was south of a sea, the Mediterranean, which was considered to be a location of civilization, it had to be part of Europe, but because they were African and Arabs and Muslims, obviously they could not be really part of Europe. The only way they could prolong Europe would be through colonialism. So that part would be detached from the African continent and attached to Europe as colonialism, and remained what Hegel called Africa proper. Africa proper meaning Africa south of Sahara. So actually this fragmentation of Africa as and this idea, which is still probably in the back of many minds, that authentic Africa is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, or even racializing it as Black Africa, was actually the most Eurocentric fragmentation of Africa. We should not be reproducing that. And in a way, the reinvention of Pan-Africanism was a good answer to that. In our book, I mentioned that even if in the title we have Africa in the plural, we should be aiming at Africa in the singular. Africa from Cape Town to Cairo, meaning that Pan-Africanism was the invention of the new word. I mean, you have all these Jamaicans and African Americans who coined Pan-Africanism as talking more about their relationship, the relationship of the diaspora to the continent. And it became continentalized and internalized after World War II, when it was not anymore the likes of Marcus Garvey or W.E.B. Du Bois, who were the heralds of Pan-Africanism, but Kwame Nkrumah. And it was clear at that time that Pan-Africanism was a way of recontinentalizing the notion, the very notion of Africa, recontinentalizing meaning two things. First of all, that the meaning was not to be coming from outside, from the diaspora, but from the continent. And it was the continent in totality, and not just the continent as the source of Black diaspora and cultures in the New World. So it was, we Africans come in all shapes and colors. I mean, we are Africans from, as I said, Cairo to Cape. And so that is the Pan-Africanism that we have to inhabit, and get rid of this idea of what is really African, authentically African. And Africanity, obviously, Africanness is an open question, but we should keep that open precisely and not close it on racializing the idea of Africanity. And that is the Pan-Africanism we should be fighting for. And yes, philosophical thinking is universal. You know, when philosophy, Greek philosophy, was translated in the Islamic world, philosophers who did those translations did not ask themselves, okay, is this really European foreign to us, and so on and so forth. They translated that into their own languages. They had to coin new words in their own languages for that philosophical thinking. And they translated very easily their own question and problematics coming from the fact that they were Muslim, that they were living in different lands, etc., in that language of Greek philosophy. And this is how so-called Islamic philosophy, this is a very convenient expression when you teach it academically, is at the same time, yes, something particular in the history of philosophy, but at the same time, something universal in terms of being the expression of universal philosophical thinking. So I totally agree with you. And again, I agree on the universal as the openness of horizon. How do we keep it open? I think that it is naturally going to be kept open, because the plural in this case never ceases to be plural. This is not a plurality going towards homogeneity and again, the superimposition of one overarching conception of the universality. It is a movement, and a movement that is going to be productive. I gave as an example what it means to come together in our plurality with the plurality of our own epistemic vision, different visions of what is the relationship between the human and her environment and nature, etc., etc. And so these are not going to be unified or homogenized in any way. On the contrary, and the philosopher that I like very much, Pierre de Chardin, said something very true, which is that union dissociates. In fact, you can come together, but that coming together and that convergence does never actually eliminates the plurality from which you are coming from. And to take, not Teilhard de Chardin anymore, but one post-colonial thinker like Edouard Glissant. Edouard Glissant considered that the word, the word as a totality should be a word of relation, but at the same time of opacity. In other words, the couple goes together. Opacity means that you never reach this kind of transparency of a culture to another culture. This was the Eurocentric gesture par excellence. You send your anthropologists around the world and you think that you are allowed to know the rest of the world because you think you know yourself. In other words, you are transparent to yourself, and now you are going to teach the rest of the world who they are because you know who they are better than they know who they are. That is the ultimate Eurocentric gesture of thinking that everybody else is transparent to you. Opacity was what Edouard Glissant opposed to that notion, but at the same time, opacity is not self-enclosure, but relation. And thinking together the couple opacity and relation, if you want to translate it in Glissant terms, seems to me a good answer to your question of the openness. And you are absolutely right by that, by the way, about that. Arabic is an African language. I mean, if we start looking at languages, and I agree also with you that we are using the term Eurocentric or decolonize knowledge, decolonize this or decolonize that in a way that becomes at one point simply absurd. We will reach a point where we will decide that mathematics is quintessentially Western and that we should be decolonizing mathematics in a way. It is meaningless, and we have to say that very clearly. There are certain things that are meaningless, and this is the reason why we have to come back to this idea that the defense of the plural should go along with this old humanist idea that if I am a human, nothing human is foreign to me, as you quoted as well. So thank you again, Emma.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, the discussion. So we have a lot of questions. So some of you are sending 3 questions at a time. So there's a lot of people participating in the conference. Please let's limit it to 1 question. We only have 40 minutes to go. So I'll start some of the questions for Professor Souleymane to respond to. Nina has, but this is just a comment. Nina, Alexis, Brazo, when we say Bandung, thanks for opening it up with Bandung, but Indonesia needs to be recognized too. So, and then from Jonathan, he's asking, Jonathan Doe, he's asking other universal questions. So maybe if we have time, we can come to it later on for the project Other Universal that Professor Souleymane cannot answer to. So let me start with the Alatas Syed Farid's questions, 2 questions. And then I'll add Brenda Combs' question too. So when you refer, so she's saying, no, anyway, when you refer to European universalism, do you not mean actually European parochialism that presents itself as universalism? And what would you say are differences between post-colonial theory and decolonial thought, especially in the African context? That's 2. And then the third question is, thank you very much, Professor Diagne. Could you please say more about untranslatability? I'm sorry, but you know what I mean. So how do we think about the possibility of incommensurability? So we'll start with those 3 questions. And do you have it, Professor?
Yes, yes, thank you. Well, very quickly about Bandung, I agree. I should probably have mentioned also, but it was not needed in its context, that Bandung was in Indonesia, and Indonesia played a role. Sukarno played a very important role in putting together the Bandung conference in the first place. Now, yes, European universalism, what I agree that this would be just parochialism presented as universal. You are presenting your own, let's take the language. You consider, and 19th century is full of this discussion among Europeans about which language is closer to the ideal of the the universal language, but this idea of having one language being universal and other languages being just approximations of a human language is a good way of saying that, yes, you take your own particularism and you present it as universal. Just one example now. France's notion of laïcité as a model, the universal model of secularism. You do have many forms of secularism. American secularism is not France's secularism, is not Senegalese secularism, is not secularism in India, etc., which is, by the way, being very much challenged. But because these countries all have different historical trajectories, we could agree that if we understand by secularism the need to have religious pluralism and therefore separation between religion and the state, that would be a universal goal to aim for, but obviously this is going to take different form. Postcolonial, decolonial, there is obviously an overlap on the two, and people sometimes use the words indifferently, and words have less meaning than they have actually usages. It depends on how you use them, but one basic distinction made is that postcolonial has more to do with a historical approach of things, as the word post indicate. What does it mean to move from a word of domination and imperialism to the word where colonialism has disappeared? Decolonial, which is coming more from works of academics and authors from South Africa, has more to do with epistemological decolonization, not just the pluralism of societies and historicities and trajectories, but in this particular case also epistemological decolonization. But again, there is an overlap between the two. So untranslatability is important because, again, if I say that encounter, the model of encounter is translation. What is translation? Translation, you give hospitality to something that has been created or thought in a language. You give to it hospitality in your own language. But obviously, a language has a way of approaching things. Each language, in a way, is a unique perspective on the reality. This is not to say that translation is not possible, but translation, and everybody who has translated a text from a language to another language knows that at one point you have to make choices. And you can make a choice that sounds strange even in the language in which you are translating. If I read something in French, for example, and I come across an expression that seems strange to me, I could say, okay, I know that the one I owe this text to, because he has translated it for me, translated it from German, so this is probably a German way of saying things. So even if it is correct in French, I can feel the foreign language in it, because the translator has come across what we would call an untranslatable. Doesn't mean you cannot bring it into another language, but this is the moment when you meet the very core of the foreign language as foreign. So this brings me again, and one way of looking at it is to make a rapprochement with what I said about Glissant's notion of opacity and relation. Translation is possible, that is to say, you can always put in relation two languages. The ethics of translation works. At the same time, the very operation of putting them together, of bringing the content from a language to another language, makes you meet the moment when you can say, oh, this is the untranslatable in that particular language, and let me see why it is untranslatable. And a translator usually makes the decision of probably, sometimes you even keep the word or the expression in the original language, and then you put a footnote. That is to say, the whole question of the untranslatable, you transfer to the paratext, as it is called, everything going from footnotes to glossaries at the end of what you are doing, and so on and so forth. So you at the same time meet in the operation of putting together two languages, you meet the relation and the opacity, and that opacity is what I call the untranslatable. And now in translation studies, people are very, very interested in the untranslatable precisely. How come you cannot really have this word for that one, etc. And yeah, thank you for the questions.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is from my colleague here in Addis Ababa, Shurafel. Given that the equal sign in translation is punctured by a slash inequality, and we take untranslatability as a generative site to rethink the universal. I'm thinking of, for instance, Abdul Fattah Kilto's idea, you shall not speak, translate my language, as one example of untranslatability. I cannot say that word. The second question is, how do we understand the notion of common ground? Isn't it also about acknowledging one's own historicity instead of looking for sheer commonalities? So before I go into the next question, these are two questions. So let's just address that, and then I'll go to the next, because the next is like three. So.
Right, but thank you for those questions. Obviously, yes, one has, when one has this kind of optimism vis-a-vis translation, which is obviously something I have, one also has to be not naive at all about the inequality between languages. And thank you for emphasizing that. Because if you look at the sociology or the politics of translation, what you witness is inequality between languages. If I ask the very simple political and sociological question of what is translated in the word in which language, as soon as you start answering that, you see the hierarchy of languages. So when the idea of translation as a way of going towards horizontal or lateral universal is bracketing out in a way the sociological and political, which gives us inequality, to look at the very act of what it means actually to translate from a language to another one, and then you are dealing with the ethics of translation. So basically my talk here and my discussion with Amselle in the book was about the ethics of translation and not the sociology or politics of translation. So, so this is clear. Now, untranslatable, the question is it a way of rethinking the universal? Absolutely, absolutely. I gave an example very quickly. Let me come back in a more precise way to it. When the Islamic word was translating into Arabic Greek philosophy, this was a very important moment of translation and a moment when the untranslatable itself became a philosophical problem and a way of questioning universality. The verb to be, it was mentioned by Chika in his reading of our discussion, that one of the points in which colonial imperialism was saying that African languages were lacking this or that, the fact that they were considered to be lacking the verb to be. This is very Eurocentric point. Indo-European languages are built in a way where you have always S is P, a subject is a predicate. Socrates is a philosopher. So, and you have many languages where you do not have the copula to be. And to say that a language that doesn't have the copula to be and who does things in a different way is incomplete, is lacking, is absurd. It is not that it is lacking the verb to be, it is just that the mode of attribution of a predicate to a subject using the copula to be is characteristic of Indo-European languages, and all human languages are not Indo-European. In this particular case, philosophy, ontology precisely, has very much insisted on the verb to be. The ontological categories of Aristotle are totally connected to the very use of the verb to be in Greek language. And every Indo-European language who has the equivalent of that, the verb einai in Greek, to be, the verb être in French, the verb to be, and the capacity to add something to it to go from be to being. You have that in French, être, étant. You have it in all the European language. It is, again, to use the word that was used earlier by Said Farid, the parochialism of European languages. Now, to make that a model, when the Arabs translated into Arabic, in the Arabic language, you do not use the verb to be in that sense. You could have equivalent, but usually you don't say Socrates is a philosopher, you say Socrates philosopher. So here is a meeting with the notion of the untranslatable. How do you go around it? Aristotle, having insisted on the form, the canonical form of the proposition S is P, how do you manage to translate in a language that where the attribution doesn't function in the same way? Aristotle's logic and ontology. It was done. So you meet the untranslatable and you manage to translate the untranslatable, that is to say, to adapt it in your own language, and you adapt it to the logic of your language. This is what translators do. And in that particular case, you have a very precise way of asking yourself, what does it mean for something to be universal? If I say that the most universal philosophical question is the question of being, in fact, I am saying that just because I am speaking a language which is English, where you go from the verb to be to being as a substantive with the form ing. How do you say that the most important problem in philosophy is being in area language or in my Wolof language and so on and so forth? So having to do that operation of translation teaches you many things. It teaches you to question the very universality of the question that you considered universal in the first place. And you look at the way in which actually it is tied to a particular linguistic form. It teaches you something about the language you are translating from, and it teaches you something about the language in which you are translating. And this is the, I would call it the beauty of translation, to use here an aesthetic term. About common ground, again, this is not ahistorical, and the model and the example I gave of the coming together in a multilateral way to look at our climate, the COP, the different COP, conference of parties organized by United Nations, I consider it as a interesting illustration of that. Even if they end in failure, as the last two have done, the very notion that we have a common ground because we have a common concern, we are discovering that this earth on which we are living is finite. It is not open-ended, and when we talk about natural resources, they are finite as well. And this forces a common ground upon us. And we have to come together and deal with the fact that we have to learn how to inhabit together our earth. And this is a model for me of what it means to have a common ground and to have a universal of negotiation and translation. Everybody has to translate the same concern and issue in their own terms. In this case, I'm using language in a metaphorical way.
Thank you. So Kelly Gillespie said that drawing on Lisa for your point on translation is very beautiful, and she wanted to thank you. So the next question is Nimi Hoffman. I'll forego the Mancha Diawara question for the sake of time. So the next question you asked was, I wondered what you thought about Kwame Apia's argument that there is no such thing as Western civilization. Is that view justified? And if so, can we, with consistency, talk about African civilizations? So the second one is, how might Archie Mathege's conceptualization of Africanity as a combative ontology fit in here, especially his emphasis on the right to universalism and how economic imperialism undermines this right? It suggests that there is a relationship between epistemic rights and economic rights. The next question is way out of that. So let's do these two, Professor.
Okay. So, well, I didn't know that Mancha was with us, so I will not answer his question, but I say hi to him.
Actually, she asked a question. Does your book enter into conversation with Mancha Diawara's book In Search of? If so, how? So you don't have to explain it, but you can say
okay.
yes or no.
All right. Okay. Yes. It was a kind of homage to Mancha as well. Yeah. Now, Kwame Appiah's point that there is no Western civilization. Before I come to the way in which he said it, what he meant by that, let me say that actually this was also something that the Mahatma Gandhi famously said. I mean, there is a report that the Mahatma Gandhi was asked once, "Oh, you are fighting against for independence and you are disparaging the West and so on and so forth. But come on, you would have respect for Western civilization. What do you think about Western civilization?" And the Mahatma Gandhi is reported to have said that would be a good idea. So what he was saying, that he was not seeing the West as civilization, he was seeing the West as the barbarism of colonialism and imperialism. So you have different phases of that. Now, the way in which Kwame Appiah meant it is also something that you find actually in Edward Said. We should not be wearing metaphysical lens to look at the world and have these massive ideas. Western civilization is this, Oriental civilization is that, African civilization is this, and turning all so-called civilizations into islands. Western civilization, I mentioned, for example, translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic at one point. One other aspect of that is the transfer of whatever was translated into Europe through Spain and Southern, etc. In other words, what I'm saying is that if we want to call something Oriental civilization, well, Oriental civilization is at the heart of Western civilization. The word is Europeanized. It is also Indianizing. It is also Africanizing in a way. So I am more of a Deleuzian way of thinking, which is close to what Kwame is saying here, about these civilizations being always an idea of encounters as well, to come back to a word that was used by Emma in her reading of my work. So that is what Kwame Appiah meant by this idea that we should not give ourselves this massive notion of something that we would call Western civilization. The danger would be to invent in the way that the West has invented Africa, to come back to the title of Mudimbe. The danger would be ourselves to invent something that we call the West in a very massive way, and then we are always confronting the West, and we end up actually seeing ourselves through the lenses, the metaphysical lenses of that division between the West and the rest. And I think that is what Kwame Appiah is warning us against here. Well, I would think that what I try to say about in this book would be in line with what Archie Mathege's said about combative ontology and right to universality as well. Dismissing totally any kind of notion of universality would be, I think, not only not feasible, but a total mistake. The fight is not the fight for a fragment. The fight, again, is the fight for the universal. You have to say that when I say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't make sense for you to answer me by saying, well, white lives matter too, or all lives matter, which is being done mainly by white supremacists nowadays. You have to understand that when I say Black Lives Matter, I am actually claiming the humanity of the human in general, and I am saying something in terms of combative ontology precisely against the very fact that my claim that Black Lives Matter is an answer to dehumanization in the first place. And if I respond to dehumanization, what I am fighting for is the human in general and the value of human life in general. That is the way in which the universal is inscribed in the particular, and the particular is not just self-enclosure in itself. So I would like to think that this is in line with what I have learned from Archie Mafeje for the many years when I had the joy indeed of working next to him and having him as a mentor, as we both worked for Codessia. And yes, same with epistemic rights and economic rights. Yes, absolutely. In epistemic rights, I mentioned very quickly the idea that all epistemes have something to bring to the table of this universal of encounter and translation. An example I gave, to come back to the decolonial in South America, all this idea that you had these traditional epistemes in which and philosophies where we should be paying attention to what is said in those wisdoms and philosophies about the relationship between the human being and her environment, which is something you find also in African epistemologies and so on and so forth. But you have to reconstruct them in a way that you can bring them into the mainstream academia under the terms of academia. Again, having a sense of a kind of struggle of episteme and so on and so forth. I'm dismissing something that I construct as Western episteme to make room for what I would consider indigenous episteme, etc., etc. That would be again absurd, and it is not a way of taking into account pluralism. Cutting myself from mathematics or logic and so on and so forth because I would be claiming a radically different logic or a radically different outlook on the world, etc., is just absurd for me. Oh, I cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, I've muted.
Oh, it's fine. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question from Tony Lamana. So I'm going to forego the first question, which is class and universalism. Kind of Professor touched upon because we're running out of time. So I'm going to take your two questions, and the third question from El Kunu. And then one last question after that. We won't tire you out. We'll be done. So you talked about vertical and horizontal universality. What about a transversal universal that would not destroy the richness of diversity? And the next question is, would not the universal also go beyond postcolonialism and make ourselves? And the next question is, thank you for the presentation, Professor Diagne. I'm curious in knowing where the peculiar dynamism of culture and identity fit in the quest in finding commonalities. So after we do this, we have one last question from Aaron, and we'll close it with that. So Professor.
Yes, I'll try to go very fast on this. First of all, vertical, horizontal, transversal actually is probably even a better word than horizontal, but I connect transversal to horizontal. If transversal, I insist on trans. That is the capacity precisely to cross borders. And that is why I consider that a good model for this horizontal universal would be the model of translation. If we look at the etymology of the word, latio is just the movement trans-crossing border. And this is something that translation teaches us, making the decentering, the movement of decentering out of my own language, the capacity to see things from different perspectives, from the perspective of a given language and from the perspective of another language. When I move from English to French, or more radically from both languages to my own Wolof language, I can see that I am really crossing a border and in a way saying things differently, even if I am the same one thinking the same thing. Yeah, universal should be going beyond the postcolonial. It is just that it is the postcolonial that posed the question of the universal. The idea of a West self-assured that it is the unique incarnation of the universal, what actually questioned that view was the postcolonial, and we are living philosophically in that postcolonial moment. This is probably why we talk so much about the relationship between the universal and the postcolonial, but yeah, they could be thought of independently. The dynamism of culture, that's a very interesting, important question. No easy answer to it. I would just say that I see it, coming back to Aimé Césaire, as what Césaire called the capacity of initiative of a culture. Césaire said that imperialism aims at the destruction of other cultures and replacing them. But he said that the worst thing that could happen to a culture is not to be under attack, but to see its own capacity of initiative destroyed. The very matrix that makes a culture continuously creative. Because if you have a very defensive conception of your culture, you say, oh, I'm under attack, and then you circle the wagons. You circle the wagons around what? If you consider that this is something static that you have to preserve and defend, you are already killing your own culture, because you have a conception of your culture as already dead. If you think of its mortality, you have to think in terms of its creativity, its capacity to change, to create, to produce new things. And this is why when he came to Dakar in 1966, the most important speech that Aimé Césaire made was to tell African artists, do not try to imitate yourself. In other words, African art, rightly studied by Senghor, William Abraham, and the likes, they all paid attention to the fact that it turns its back to mimesis. African art, more generally, but you do have naturalist art, of course, but generally is non-mimetic. It is not an imitation of reality, but a different approach of the sub-reality lying underneath some the forms are they are given in reality. And he said, well, so African art is not about the imitation of reality, yes. But what would make our own art die is if we repeat ourselves. We decide to just imitate ourselves continuously instead of tapping the very source of creativity, which is totally unpredictable in us. And which is going to depend on what the circumstances are, what our history to come is. Basically, what he was saying is the future of African art is what we are going to make of it. It does more depend upon what we want it to be than what it has been in the past. So that's what I would call the initiative, the capacity of initiative, again, quoting here Aimé Césaire. And that's the kind of response I can give to the question of dynamism of culture.
Thank you, sir. So this is the last question from Aaron, who's part of the Other Universal project from the University of West Indies. So his question is, I was glad for the welcome attention to Bandung, a landmark moment for certain. But I wonder about what the general genealogy of postcolonialism, even those that give deserved attention to major figures like Fanon and Césaire, misses by its lack of attention to the prior work on slavery and white supremacy by Black diaspora radical intellectuals for over a century prior to Bandung. How precisely does this work? To take two singular examples, the Haitian and African American intellectual traditions from the 19th century work in your sense of the field, Professor Diagne. Let me also convey my, he had to leave early so that it's recorded. If he's left, it's going to be recorded so he'll get it. So if you can respond to that, Professor Diagne, that'll be great.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, Bandung is just a symbolic date. When you say the conference of Bandung in 1955 can be seen as the post-colonial moment, the reason for that is, as I tried to explain, but that was too quick probably, the fact that the global South, generally speaking, not everybody was there, but the general South was meeting without being summoned by what was considered to be the center. So it is a symbol of decentering, of a decentered word in which we can think of a truly universal universalism or a truly universal universal rather than the old overarching universal, the vertical universal. That is why. But once you have defined a moment as being that kind of symbol, obviously when you look at the archaeology of it, it will go deep historically beyond that date. It would go back to the time of slavery when people fought against slavery. I mean, you could, and in that genealogy, you would go all the way to the likes of Frederick Douglass and beyond, and even obscure figures who just fought, had this combative ontology, to come back again to the Ashima Fege phrase that was earlier evoked. So again, I'm making here a distinction between a moment that can be distinguished and rated as such, that would be the Bandung. But then when we look at the archaeology and the genealogy that precisely made that moment possible, and then we go deep inside our own history, both on the continent and in the diaspora.
That was the last question. So I would like to thank you, Professor Diagne, for this fascinating talk today on behalf of my colleagues of the Other Universal Project. We really, we're very happy that you were here. Hopefully we'll meet in person in some future meeting of Other Universal, and you can give us not the same kind of talk, but maybe another type of talk. But this is really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody who raised a question, my discussants, and also those who did not raise a question but were here. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for the participants. Thank you for the participants who raised very interesting questions today. And the next talk will be on July 30th. Hopefully, you'll all meet us then, July 30th, with Edo Getachew on her book, World Making After Empire. Thank you so much, everybody. So ready to close now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.